Christianity.
Rumors about various immoral activities, which history would prove were completely unfounded, frightened the learned elite, who were trying to bring Western civilization out of the Dark Ages.
There was a cannibalistic infanticide, the slaying of infants and allegedly the eating of them. There was promiscuous sex between dancing, which was considered to be the ultimate moral outrage.
The majority of those accused of being witches were women.
There was this feeling that women were the more carnal of the species, and this is indeed one of the reasons why members of the clerical and lay elite suspected women more than men as witches, because it was believed that they were weaker morally and also
man has utilized torturous methods to display power and maintain order. With fear at the core, punishment has been a case study in creativity of the most diabolical kind.
Torture seems to be an integral part of human nature.
From the feast days of ancient Rome to the guillotine of revolutionary France, the ultimate penalty was intended to be neither private nor painless.
It was a mass production line of death.
Are we better off today than we were in the days of the rack and rope? Or is the history of punishment doomed to repeat itself? Perhaps the earliest record of a system of punishment dates to the 18th century BC. The ancient Babylonians in the Code of Hammurabi set down very specific punishments for each crime. The ruling principle being lex talionis, an eye for an eye. A surgeon who caused loss of life had his hand amputated. A slave who disobeyed his master lost an ear. Fines, whipping, and branding were prescribed for lesser offenses, but the majority of crimes were all punishable by death. Records show the ancient Egyptians had various state-sanctioned methods of execution. In fact, the earliest recorded death sentence was carried out in Egypt in the 16th century BC, when a nobleman accused of performing magic was ordered to take his own life. Death for commoners was usually beheading with an axe. Death by burning, which was believed to destroy the person's ba, their soul, was reserved for one of the worst offenders, unfaithful wives. What was conspicuously absent in all of these ancient laws was the concept of imprisonment as a form of. This is the single greatest distinction between ancient and modern punishment. Justice was measured not in years, months, or even days served. It was a single act of retribution, the rules of which were defined by the ancient Greeks, beginning in the 7th century BC.
In Greek times, torture was part of the legal code, much as, indeed, capital punishment.
According to the Draconian Code, death became the penalty for every crime. Beginning in the 6th century BC, the Greeks experimented with more and more dramatic ways of carrying out public death sentences. The most notorious innovation was called the brazen bull, a kind of human pressure cooker.
Shut inside, and the fires lit, and his cries were turned into music for the edification of the king.
The brazen bull was a harbinger of even more gruesome public spectacle to come. In 451 BC, with the writing of the 12 Tables, the Romans began to systematize their rules of punishment. A number of offenses were punishable by death. and at the height of its power, Roman executions became elaborately staged games of unimaginable cruelty.
Seeing those persons suffer by the manner of their death. The impulse, presumably, among the audience was that these people deserved to die.
A presidential election campaign. They became grander and grander affairs involving literally hundreds or even thousands of deaths.
In the centuries that followed, the incredible spectacle of death in the Colosseum rose and fell with the Roman Empire. Very early in its history, the Romans showed a fondness for unusual methods of execution. In addition to the standard fare of beheading, flogging, hanging, and drowning, particularly heinous crimes punished with particularly horrible ways of death.
The goals of Roman punishment were to definitely dispose other people to not follow in his path.
For those who killed a family member, there was a diabolical death penalty called the cullius.
The victim was put in a sack and thrown in a river, and their efforts to escape from the sack and imminent drowning would be such that they would lead to an appalling death.
But not all criminals were subjected to the same fate. By the 3rd century BC, Rome began to distinguish between the different classes when meting out punishment. In particular, rebellious slaves, Jews, criminals, and a small but growing religious sect known as Christians received no mercy. By the 1st century AD, death by burning or crucifixion were common methods of execution.
Crucifixion is a long, drawn-out method of execution because the nails were passed through the wrists. There's a very long, drawn-out dying process involved there, particularly if the crucified person is exposed to the sun. It could last for several days.
Never did anybody go up and kill off. And so it means that your soul wanders homeless and tortured for the everlasting afterwards.
At the beginning of the 3rd century AD, a change in Roman law ushered in a new and even more brutal era in Roman punishment. As a result of a population boom and a growing underclass, Rome had a surplus of criminals awaiting execution, and new and even more horrendous methods of death were permitted to meet the demand.
One way of punishing criminals would be to send them to the theater, and when in the story there comes a point where an actor has to die, the actor steps off the stage verisimilitude.
And death as theater was spectacularly realized at the Roman Colosseum, where legions of condemned men, and even some women, became fodder for the bloodlust of the audience.
Honour of a death. And they emerged then, through the centuries after that, as a major public spectacle.
The amount of blood shed in a typical day at the Games is difficult to comprehend.
They usually seem to have begun with beast fights. In between, there would be executions in the arena at midday, mainly by means of exposing persons to the beasts.
A lucky few among the condemned were trained as gladiators, lucky because there was a slight possibility of survival.
Gladiators can win their freedom. The meaner, the more violent, the more brutal you were, the better you had a chance of surviving.
However, the majority of criminals were not trained as gladiators. They were simply thrown into the arena and rarely left it in one piece.
Apart from fighting, Romans were particularly fond of using exotic animals from Africa, which they had conquered, animals like lions and cheetahs.
These people in the amphitheater were never likely to travel to see any of these far corners of the empire, so these exotic...
But getting a wild animal to kill on cue was not always easy.
So they had to specially train animals to attack and bite and shred and tear human beings.
There was an animal that would even come out of its cage, whether it would maul the person only slightly, whether it would kill the person.
Like Broadway producers, who are only as good as their last, these Romans added scenery, props, and costumes to the Beast Games. They created plays in which the condemned person portrayed a character, usually from mythology. The scenarios changed, but the ending was always the same.
You might have a criminal being made to look like Orpheus, given a lyre to hold, and perhaps surrounded by tame animals, so that if he strummed his lyre, it would look like Orpheus charming
cast
nature.
as goddesses, and were ordered to wear women's clothing, or they were forced to enact the myth of Attis and perform self-castration.
It's really hard for us to see the performance of one of these charades might have...
Were drawn in with some kind of enjoyment, got something out of it psychologically. What they got out of it was a manifestation of their most crude and nasty emotions.
Precisely how many condemned men and women were executed in the Roman spectacles is unknown. It is also unknown whether these types of public punishments deterred crime, since no such statistics were kept. Death in the arena continued well into the 5th century AD.
When history changes and the spectators no longer go along with it and instead undergo a sense of revulsion, or a sense that what they're witnessing is grotesque.
That change coincided with the rise of Christianity as a powerful political and social force. Citizens began protesting the brutality of gladiatorial combat. In 404, while attending a gladiatorial spectacle, a monk named Telemachus became a martyr to punishment reform.
He could no longer hold himself back from this most unchristian behavior, and so he jumped to focus public opinion on the brutality. Then there is a great rise in protest.
Death in the arena by man or beast was outlawed within a few years. But this was not an end of gruesome forms of punishment, only a shift in the methods used.
There's always been a terrible conflict within religion in relation to cruel behavior.
Christians would no longer be the victims of torture, but the torturers themselves.
Torture was inflicted by experts who knew to the nth degree just how much the victim should be able to accept. Too little, and the victim.
The Roman Empire had collapsed, and with it, their code of law.
When Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe,
by the end of the first millennium, the early Christian church was gaining power and took authority over the law. They adopted an ingenious, if flawed, method for determining guilt or innocence and meting out punishment in one fell swoop. It was called trial by ordeal.
you're in the right, God will protect you. If you're telling the truth, put your hand into this fire here, and if you are telling the truth, God will protect you and your hand will not be burned.
If you were not telling the truth, your punishment was literally at hand. The trials ranged from a hand over a flame for minor infractions to submitting limbs to red-hot irons or boiling water for capital crimes. Not surprisingly, the accused was almost always found guilty. Trial by ordeal was the standard for more than a century.
Sending out judges into the kingdom to carry out inquiries and They, of course, from the Latin called inquisitors, which gives us the Holy Inquisition.
Inquisitors, usually Dominican or Franciscan friars, were charged with stamping out all signs of opposition to the church, even the most seemingly innocuous.
The overwhelming majority of individuals were saying that a fornication outside of the boundaries of marriage was not a sin, or saying that the Virgin Mary was no virgin.
The early inquisitors appointed by the Holy Office in Rome were genuine men who went out and tried to convert heretics back to the Roman religion. They did their very best, and in fact some of them were remarkably gentle. They're very different from
Queen Isabella of Spain asked Pope Sixtus IV to allow Spain independent control over its own Inquisition. The Pope agreed, with the understanding that Spain would follow the code of conduct set down by the Church. But Spain adhered to no such understanding. The Spanish Inquisition began by targeting Jews who had converted to Catholicism. All of the first into court.
There was little sign.
And this process was complicated by the fact that from the very start, the Inquisition was practiced. And the purpose of this procedure, this inquisitio, this long inquiry, is not designed to get you off. It's designed to extract from you a confession.
The first Grand Inquisitor, Tomás de Torquemada, authorized his inquisitors to extract as many confessions as possible by any means necessary.
And they would say, well, look, here's the torture chamber. You're liable for torture unless you tell us more. And the person said, well, they stripped them naked. And there's a series of different kinds of tortures that could be employed.
The rack, first of all, provided with a windlass so that it could be gradually tightened, the ropes could be pulled a bit at a time, and then to make it easy,
Inch by inch. And this, of course, imposed an appalling strain on every single joint in his body. Hips, knees, ankles, shoulder blades.
A small group of inquisitors rose to the challenge of inflicting pain without causing bloodshed.
Now, the book takes many forms, but basically what it consists of is some means of driving wedges between the bones of the leg, which are held perhaps in a big boot-shaped object.
A pear-shaped metal object which was hinged at one end and attached around the victim's head by means of an iron strap, the pear being forced into his mouth. And by degrees, the screw mechanism, it was slowly opened.
Was applied in stages. First, the accused was hoisted on a winch with a 180-pound weight attached to his feet. If he or she did not confess, the weight was increased to 250 pounds.
If that did not produce the confession, they would drop the person down, and then just before the accused
All the time next to him would be seated a scribe ready to write down every
in the
word.
torture chamber. There's this notary, the scribe, who says, now, and they poured one jar down the person's throat.
The torture used to extract a confession was the worst part of the punishment.
If a person confessed their
And
heresy,
paying a fine were the most common punishments, unless the accused refused to confess.
if they stuck by the truth perhaps and maintained their innocence, the torture would go on until ultimately they would be handed over to the secular authorities and denounced
As a deterrent to future transgressors, and as a display of the power of church and state.
It's a very public thing, and it's a communal thing. Announcements are set out, special costumes are ordered for the penitents. They march into the town square where they encounter a huge scaffold that the king has come down with the court to witness this collective act of faith. And it's like the Last Judgment in miniature, and that's what they're reenacting. This public theater, public religious theater, in which you're going to see the damned go in one direction, and those people who are, in the sense where they're given one more chance to recant. And those who do so at the last minute, they kind of get off lucky because they're strangled before the fires are set. But those who are stubborn to the end, they would be immolated by fire.
The basic principle...
During the Spanish Inquisition, an estimated 13,000 supposed heretics were burned alive. Countless others bore the scars of their tortured confessions. The Inquisition continued until the 1600s, when it began to wane. But elsewhere throughout Europe, the flames of death by fire still burned brightly. In the years between 1450 and 1750, as many as 100,000 people, mostly women, were executed for a single crime: witchcraft. Western civilization in the Middle Ages may not have had a unifying code of crime and punishment, but there was one legal matter on which there was almost universal agreement. Witches had to be punished, usually ending in death. And while the clergy was busy with the Inquisition, it was the secular rulers and judges who prosecuted witches
And of Christianity.
Rumors about various immoral activities, which history would prove were completely unfounded, frightened the learned elite, who were trying to bring Western civilization out of the Dark Ages.
There was cannibalistic infanticide, the slaying of infants and allegedly the eating of them. There was promiscuous sex between dancing, which was considered to be the ultimate moral outrage.
The majority of those accused of being witches were women.
There was this feeling that women were the more carnal of the species, and this is indeed one of the reasons why members of the clerical and lay elite suspected women more than men as witches, because it was believed that they were weaker morally and also